AD January 17th, 1940, 11:47 a.m., above the frozen coastline of the North Sea. The air at 20,000 feet bit like broken glass. Frost crept across the canopy of Oberleutnant Klaus Hoffmann's Messerschmitt, Bf 109, and his breath came in shallow clouds inside the cramped cockpit. Below him, the slate-gray water churned in silence, indifferent to the war being waged in the sky above it. Hoffmann's gloved fingers rested lightly on the control stick, his eyes scanning the horizon through the gun sight. The winter sun hung low and pale, casting long shadows across the formations of German fighters patrolling the air corridor between occupied Denmark and the British Isles. It was supposed to be a routine escort mission, 12 bombers returning from a failed raid on British shipping lanes, protected by 15 fighters, Hoffmann's staffel among them. The morning had been quiet, too quiet. The kind of silence that crawled under your skin and whispered warnings your conscious mind refused to hear. Then, through the static hiss of his radio, a voice crackled sharp and urgent. "Contact, single aircraft, British markings, 2 o'clock low." Hoffmann banked right, squinting through the glare. There it was, a lone supermarine Spitfire, weaving lazily through the clouds like a falcon toying with prey it had already caught. The RAF roundel gleamed against the dull green fuselage. It was absurdly bold, reckless. One British fighter against 15 German machines. Hoffmann felt the Predator's grin pull at the corner of his mouth. This would be over in minutes. "All units, engage!" The squadron leader's voice rang through the radio. "Let's send this fool home in pieces." The formation broke. 15 fighters peeled away from the bombers and dove toward the lone Spitfire, engines screaming, propellers clawing through frozen air. Hoffmann pushed the throttle forward, feeling the familiar surge of acceleration press him back into his seat. The distance closed rapidly. 2,000 meters, 1,500, 1,000. The Spitfire seemed oblivious, continuing its leisurely arc through the clouds. Then it turned. If you find these stories of courage and strategy inspiring, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your support helps us keep these historical legacies alive. Not a frantic scramble, not a desperate evasion. A smooth, deliberate roll that positioned it directly in line with the pursuing Germans. For a heartbeat, Hoffmann felt something cold slide into his chest. The Spitfire didn't run. It watched them come. And then, impossibly, it began to accelerate, not away, but deeper into the cloud bank ahead. "He's running," someone laughed over the radio. "Keep on him." They followed, 15 hunters chasing one fox. Hoffmann kept his eyes locked on the Spitfire's tail, now barely visible as it disappeared into the thick cumulus. The clouds swallowed them whole, visibility dropped to nothing. Ice formed on his windscreen. He flew on instruments now, trusting speed and instinct, following the faint silhouette flickering in and out of the white void ahead. Then the radio exploded. "Stop chasing him! It's a trap!" The voice was raw, panicked, stripped of all military discipline. Hoffmann's hand froze on the stick. Before he could process the words, the sky erupted. Shapes materialized from the clouds like phantoms. Not one, not two, but dozens of British fighters, Spitfires, Hurricanes, even a few Defiants, arranged in perfect ambush formation. They had been waiting, hidden in the clouds, silent, patient. The lone Spitfire had never been alone. Hoffmann's mind stuttered, struggling to reconcile what his eyes were seeing. The fox had become the hound. The prey had become the trap. And 15 German fighters, spread thin and disorganized from the chase, were now caught in a killing box with nowhere to run. To understand how such a trap was possible, one must first understand the brutal mathematics of early air combat. In January 1940, the war was still young, still intoxicated with the mythology of aerial knights dueling honorably above the clouds. The German Luftwaffe had dominated the skies over Poland and Denmark with overwhelming numerical superiority and tactical aggression. Their doctrine was simple: attack decisively, overwhelm quickly, never give the enemy time to organize. It had worked, every time, until it didn't. The British Royal Air Force, bloodied but not broken, had learned hard lessons in those first months. They understood that they could not match German numbers. They could not match German industrial output, but they could match German arrogance. An arrogance, unlike fuel or ammunition, was infinite. The trap above the North Sea was not an accident. It was not luck. It was the product of weeks of careful planning by RAF Fighter Command, which had studied Luftwaffe patrol patterns with the obsessive precision of clockmakers. They noted the predictable flight paths, the rigid adherence to formation, the German pilot's instinctive aggression when presented with an apparently vulnerable target, and, most importantly, they noted the hubris, the assumption that no single British pilot would dare challenge a full German squadron unless he was suicidal or stupid. So, they designed a lure: one pilot, one Spitfire, flying just close enough to be seen, just vulnerable enough to be irresistible. His orders were clear: do not engage, do not fire, simply fly, lead them into the clouds, and trust that the wolves following you did not realize they were running toward a cliff. The pilot chosen for this mission was Flight Lieutenant James Archibald Dunning, a 23-year-old former instructor from Kent, who had logged more hours in a Spitfire than most men twice his age. He was not the best shot. He was not the most decorated, but he was calm, unnervingly, maddeningly calm, the kind of man who could fly into the teeth of 15 enemy fighters and feel his heartbeat slow instead of quicken. Dunning had been briefed 3 days earlier in a cold hangar at RAF Hornchurch. The station commander, a gaunt man with silver hair and eyes like frozen ponds, had laid out the plan on a table covered with maps and reconnaissance photos. "You will be the bait," he said simply. "And if you panic, if you deviate, if you run too fast or too slow, 15 of our boys will die in those clouds waiting for an ambush that never happens. Do you understand?" Dunning had nodded. He understood. And on the morning of January 17th, he climbed into his Spitfire, tail number K9831, and flew alone into enemy-controlled airspace, knowing that his survival depended entirely on the restraint of men trained to kill him. Klaus Hoffmann would later say that the moment the British fighters appeared from the clouds was the moment he stopped believing in invincibility. Not his own, the Luftwaffe's. For months they had been told they were the elite, the vanguard of a new order, unstoppable in the air. They had seen Polish biplanes crumble like paper. They had watched Danish fighters flee without firing a shot. They had grown accustomed to winning. Now, surrounded and outnumbered, Hoffmann realized that winning had made them stupid. The British did not hesitate. They did not gloat. They simply attacked. Hurricanes came in from above, diving with the sun at their backs. Spitfires slashed in from the flanks, their 8 machine guns stitching lines of tracers through the frozen air. A defiant, slow and awkward but bristling with turret guns, positioned itself below the scattering German formation and began firing upward in controlled bursts. The radio dissolved into chaos, voices screaming warnings, calling for help, cursing, praying. Hoffmann snap-rolled right as tracers whipped past his canopy, so close he could see individual bullets tumbling through the air. His wingman, a boy named Eric, who had celebrated his 20th birthday 2 weeks earlier, exploded in a ball of orange flame as a Hurricane's guns found his fuel tank. There was no parachute, no time, just fire, and then nothing. Hoffmann's training took over. He pulled hard into a climb, bleeding speed to force an overshoot, but the Spitfire on his tail matched him perfectly, staying locked in firing position. Rounds hammered into his tail section. His rudder went sluggish. He kicked the pedals, forcing the Bf-109 into a skidding turn, and for a brief moment gained separation. He dove. The Spitfire followed. He climbed. The Spitfire followed. It was like fighting his own shadow. Around him, the battle disintegrated into a swirling melee. German fighters scattered in every direction, abandoning formation, abandoning tactics, abandoning each other. 3 more went down in flames. Another limped away trailing black smoke, its engine coughing blood. The British pressed the attack with mechanical precision, working in pairs, covering each. Other, never committing to a single target long enough to be vulnerable. And through it all, Hoffmann caught glimpses of the lone Spitfire, the bait, the lure, the fox that had become a wolf, now circling high above the carnage, untouched, watching. Not fighting, just watching. As if marking each German fighter that fell, counting the cost of arrogance in fire and metal and lives. The battle lasted 11 minutes. When it was over, 6 German fighters had been destroyed outright. 4 more were so badly damaged they barely made it back to base, where they were written off as total losses. The remaining 5, including Hoffmann, scattered across the North Sea and fled for home in disgrace. Of the 15 pilots who had chased that lone Spitfire into the clouds, 8 never saw land again. The British lost 2 aircraft. One Hurricane with a damaged engine that ditched near the coast, its pilot rescued by a fishing boat. One Spitfire, not Dunning's, that took cannon fire to the wing, and spun into the sea. The pilot was never found. Dunning landed at Hornchurch at 12:34 p.m., his Spitfire untouched, his fuel tanks nearly empty. He climbed out of the cockpit, lit a cigarette, and said nothing. There was nothing to say. The ambush had worked exactly as planned. The Germans had followed the bait, and the sea was full of wreckage. When Hoffmann landed at his base in occupied Denmark, his hands were shaking so badly he could barely undo his harness. The ground crew stared at the holes in his fuselage, the shredded rudder, the scorch marks along the wing. No one spoke. They had heard the radio transmissions. They knew what had happened. The invincible Luftwaffe had been lured, trapped, and mauled by an enemy they had underestimated. That night, Hoffmann sat alone in the officers' mess, a glass of schnapps untouched in front of him. He kept replaying the moment the British fighters had appeared from the clouds. The shock, the disbelief, the sudden crushing understanding. That they had been hunted from the beginning. That the lone Spitfire had never been prey. It had been a performance, a carefully choreographed deception designed to exploit the one thing the Luftwaffe could not train away: pride. In his logbook, Hoffmann wrote a single sentence: "We chased a ghost and found an army." News of the ambush spread slowly through the Luftwaffe, carried in whispers and sidelong glances. Officially, it was downplayed, a tactical setback, an unfortunate engagement. But among the pilots, it became something else: a ghost story, a warning, a crack in the armor of certainty that had defined their early victories. The British were not beaten. They were learning, adapting, and they were willing to risk everything on a single pilot's nerve and a gamble that their enemies would behave exactly as predicted. The psychological impact was profound. German fighter pilots began questioning their orders. Was that lone bomber bait? Was that isolated reconnaissance plane a lure? The aggressive doctrine that had served them so well in Poland now felt like a liability. Caution crept in. Second guessing. Fear. Not of death, every pilot accepted that, but of being made a fool, of being the next man to chase a ghost into an ambush. RAF Fighter Command, meanwhile, refined the tactic. The lone bait strategy was repeated over the North Sea, the English Channel, and later over France and Belgium. Not every attempt succeeded. Some German pilots recognized the trap and broke off. Some British pilots misjudged the timing and were shot down before the ambush could spring. But enough succeeded that the tactic entered the informal playbook of fighter operations, a testament to the power of deception and the exploitation of enemy psychology. James Dunning flew the bait role 3 more times before being reassigned to a regular squadron. He was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross, though the citation was deliberately vague, mentioning only exceptional courage and initiative in combat operations. The specifics of the January 17th ambush remained classified for years. Dunning himself rarely spoke of it. When pressed by younger pilots eager for stories, he would shrug and say only, "I flew straight. They followed. That's all there was to it." But there was more. There always is. Because what happened above the North Sea that frozen January morning was not just a tactical victory. It was a revelation. A demonstration that wars are not won solely by superior machines or greater numbers, but by understanding the minds of those who fly them. The Germans had expected the British to flee, to cower, to collapse under the weight of Luftwaffe superiority. Instead, they found an enemy willing to use a single unarmed pilot as live bait, confident that 15 hunters would be too proud to smell the trap. In the years that followed, as the war ground on and the skies over Europe became graveyards of burning metal and broken men, the story of the lone Spitfire and the 15 hunters became legend. It was told in briefing rooms and barracks, embellished and distorted with each retelling until the facts blurred into myth. Some versions claimed Dunning single-handedly shot down half the German formation. Others said he was outnumbered 50-1. The truth, as always, was quieter and more terrible. Klaus Hoffmann survived the war. He flew over Britain during the Battle of Britain, over Russia during the invasion of the Soviet Union, and finally over Germany itself, as the Allies closed in from both sides. He was shot down twice, wounded once, and decorated multiple times. But in private letters to his family, he confessed that he never forgot the moment above the North Sea when he realized the enemy he had been trained to despise was smarter than he had been taught to believe. That realization, he wrote, haunted him more than any bullet or bomb ever could. Dunning also survived. He flew throughout the war, racked up 7 confirmed kills, and returned to England in 1945 with frostbite scars on his hands and a permanent tremor in his left leg. He never spoke publicly about the ambush. When historians finally uncovered the details decades later and approached him for interviews, he declined. "It was a long time ago," he said, "and I was just doing my job." But doing one's job in that frozen sky above the North Sea meant flying alone into the teeth of an enemy squadron and trusting that pride would blind them long enough for justice to arrive. It meant being the thread that unraveled certainty, the crack that split invincibility. There is a photograph, taken weeks after the battle, that captures something essential about that moment. It shows a group of RAF pilots gathered around a Spitfire at Hornchurch, leaning against the fuselage, cigarettes in hand, faces pale and exhausted. Dunning is among them, standing slightly apart, his eyes focused somewhere beyond the camera. He does not smile. None of them do. They look like men who have seen something they cannot unsee. Behind them, barely visible in the background, is a blackboard used for mission briefings. Someone has scrawled a message in chalk, half erased but still legible. The fox knows many things, but the hedgehog knows one big thing. It is a reference to an ancient Greek proverb, a fragment of philosophy left by some unknown pilot with a classical education. The meaning is ambiguous, open to interpretation. But in the context of that photograph, in the shadow of what those men had done and would continue to do, it reads like an epitaph for certainty. The Germans knew many things. They knew tactics, engineering, discipline, and aggression. But the British knew one big thing, that every hunter, no matter how skilled, becomes prey the moment they stop questioning what they see. On the seabed of the North Sea, 17 fathoms down, the wreckage of the German fighters rests in the cold and the dark. Crabs nest in the cockpits. Silt fills the engine cowlings. Rust consumes the metal. The men who flew them have long since turned to bone and memory. But the story endures, passed from generation to generation, a reminder that pride is heavier than any bomb and more deadly than any bullet. James Dunning died in 1987, quietly, in a hospital bed in Kent, surrounded by family who knew him only as a grandfather who once flew planes during the war. He was buried with military honors, his DFC ribbon pinned to his uniform, his logbook tucked into his coffin at his daughter's insistence. On the day of his funeral, the skies were clear and cold, and a single Spitfire, restored and maintained by a Heritage flight, circled overhead 3 times in salute before banking west and disappearing into the same clouds where, 47 years earlier, Dunning had led 15 hunters to their doom. Klaus Hoffmann died 2 years later, in a nursing home in Bavaria, his memories fractured by age and loss. In his final days, he spoke often of the sky, of flying, of battles that no longer made sense. His children listened politely, nodding, not understanding. But one night, hours before he died, he gripped his son's hand and whispered something that had waited decades to be spoken. "We thought we were hunting," he said, "but we were the ones being hunted from the very beginning." His son asked what he meant. Hoffmann closed his eyes and did not answer. Perhaps he could not. Perhaps some truths are too vast and too terrible to be reduced to words. The sky above the North Sea is empty now. No fighters duel in the frozen air. No hunters chase ghosts into ambushes. The war is over, and the men who fought it are gone. But the lesson remains, carved into history like a name on a gravestone. It is this, that every trap begins with an invitation, that every hunter carries within them the seed of their own undoing, and that sometimes the greatest act of courage is not to fight, but to fly, alone, unarmed, into the jaws of an enemy who believes you are nothing more than prey. James Dunning flew that path. 15 men followed, and in the 11 minutes that followed, the mythology of invincibility crumbled like frost beneath the sun. Not because the Germans lacked skill or bravery, they had both in abundance, but because they lacked doubt. And doubt, in war as in life, is the only thing that keeps you alive long enough to learn the difference between the hunter and the hunted. That is the truth the sky whispered on January 17th, 1940, as fire rained down and men fell screaming into the sea. That is the truth that echoes still, in every cockpit, in every moment of decision, in every choice between arrogance and humility. The fox knows many things, but the hedgehog knows one big thing. And on that frozen morning above the North Sea, one lone Spitfire became both fox and hedgehog, lure and lesson, bait and reckoning. The trap was perfect because it needed no deception. It needed only pride, and pride, as 15 men discovered too late, is the one weapon no armor can stop. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this historical deep dive, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments which historical figure we should cover next.